Welcome to the next WorkClub podcast. Really excited to have Vinay on the podcast today. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, Dale.
Good stuff. So just a quick background. Vinay is co-founder of Capital Placement, and the big topic that we were talking about today is remote placements. So how they can benefit your business, kind of what it's all about, the challenges of it, the pros of it. And like I said, Vinay has a wealth of experience in this area, and he's seen firsthand the kind of incredible value, really, that remote people who do remote placements can give to a lot of different firms and startups and businesses. So that's kind of what we're going to cover today. So like I said, very happy to have Vinay in on the podcast. And I think without any further ado, I'm happy to dive right in. I want to talk a bit about the backstory here, Vinay, and essentially, kind of what were the pain points that led to the inception and founding of Capital Placements? How did it all start? When did you think, okay, I think there's a gap in the market here for remote placements, and I feel like I can facilitate this.
Sure. Firstly, Dale, thank you for having me and for the intro. So just to kind of give you a bit of background, we started the company all the way back in 2012 when me and my then friend and now co-founder, Niran, were in university. We started the company predominantly as an opportunity for students to get work experience abroad, and that was the concept. And remote internships came much later for us because we realized that as much as we want young students and recent graduates to get experience abroad, there was a barrier to that. And obviously flights, visas, work visas, etc. It is difficult, it is expensive, and we wanted to make that international work experience much more achievable for a lot of young students. So as an example, someone from Sierra Leone can work for a company based out in London now without having to spend all that money on getting a work visa, getting their flights here, coming here, getting their accommodation sorted, etc. If they have the right skill set, we can then enable them to work for the right employer for them. When we started the company, the company was founded to help current students and recent graduates get work experience abroad. We were in university, and actually I remember this so vividly because one of the first lectures we had, straight after that lecture, I actually went up to him and asked him about, okay, so thanks for the insight in terms of what the workplace looks like at the moment, but what can we do to make sure we stand out from the crowd? So in that lecture theatre was about 200 students. So I asked him, okay, so what can I do today or in the near future to make sure that when I finish my degree, I have a job? And he said, it's all about work experience. So I studied law, and he said, it's all about getting work experience, building up your CV, and that is going to give you the best opportunity possible. And he said that comes with a caveat because most law firms are not hiring at the moment. So good luck with that as well. So I was like, okay, great. So me and my then friend Niran, we start talking, and then we start thinking about all the different ways where you can potentially get some work experience. And so we started looking at job boards, and there weren't many internships going available with law firms at that time. And so, but we stumbled across job boards based out in countries like in emerging economies, basically. So in the UAE and India. And we thought, okay, this is really interesting. And thought, okay, then we realized that emerging economies, especially the BRICS nations, were not as impacted with the recession as other economies. And so we thought, okay, so we can potentially get some work experience there and get some international experience that will make our CV look good. So then we started doing some research, and we thought, okay, this looks like there's a lot of things to do. We need to get a work visa, we need to sort out the internship, etc. And then we looked at what was available in the market. And the companies that were in the market were just charging extortionate amounts to basically arrange an internship and take care of the stuff. And we did the maths. We just did back of a tissue paper kind of maths. We thought, okay, accommodation is going to cost this much, visa, etc. We looked at them. We thought, okay, the margins are crazy. Let's try and do this ourselves, and let's see how it goes. And rather naively, we just send messages on LinkedIn to managing partners, managing directors of firms, and I'm not sure why, but some of them came back to us and said, yeah, we'd love to have you as an intern. And then we flew out to both Dubai and India, did our work experience. And back then we used to write a diary on Facebook every day on our experience. So we kind of talked about what we did every day, what we were doing. So we would go to work until pretty late in the evening, And then we actually had a moped in Mumbai, and we just used to just explore the city.
Oh,
It's not a
fantastic.
city. Yeah, it's not a city that I've ever been to previously. So first time there, we used to just take the moped, go around. Lovely beachfront. It has a lovely waterfront area. So we just take the moped, go down there, sit there, have some snacks, and we probably sat out there until about 1 a.m. just talking about stuff. When we came back, a lot of our friends actually wanted to have that kind of experience. And so they asked us, how do we secure the internship? Where did you stay, etc. And so we just said, okay, like this is how we got the internship. We just found accommodation through Airbnb, and this is the visa that you need to work in India legally and in UAE, etc. And then so a few more friends came along, and then friends of friends started coming along, and then we realized we have a lot more friends than we knew, and we started helping a lot of people, and eventually our university became our first proper customer, because our university came to us and said, okay, it looks like you guys are doing something interesting. We would love to have a conversation about how we could do this in a slightly bigger scale. And that's how the business was started.
Wow,
That's the long story short.
No, that's a fascinating story, and it's funny, isn't it? Like you said, sometimes you don't even realize that there's an opportunity there, or sometimes you take things for granted, right? Like people coming to you and saying, how do the visas work? Where do you stay? And yeah, like to anyone listening, never take for granted the knowledge and information you have, because there are always people out there that don't know these things. Just because you know them, don't take that as that everyone thinks the way you think and knows things. That's a fantastic story, Vinay, and yeah, so glad that it's kind of led to where it's led, and capital placement, and all those other great things you're doing.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, that was me paraphrasing what happened over an 18-month period, by the way. It wasn't a overnight success or anything. It took time. We were still in university. It wasn't our main priority when we started the company, but it was something that we thought, we were just helping friends in the beginning. We didn't even have a commercial intent. We were just helping friends with giving them ideas and giving them, just signposting them to the right places. And then what we realized was, though, that's when we start doing that when we were getting friends coming up to us on a weekly basis, that's when we started realizing, hang on, a lot of the friends were coming to us because the option that they faced was, okay, you can spend your summer or holidays in a country, getting some work experience in a country that you've never been to, culturally very different, somewhere that you potentially may not have even thought about working in, but getting that short-term work experience, or working in a supermarket or working a retail job. And so it was pretty obvious for a lot of our friends that they prefer to get some real work experience that will add a lot more to their CV. And so that's when we realized we were onto something, and it was completely accidental. It was not something that we intended to start out. Both me and my co-founder wanted to be solicitors.
It's funny because there's just so many businesses that start that way. It's, you stumble across an opportunity or something presents itself and you realize, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, there's a market here, potentially a market people don't even realize yet. Well, let's kind of fast forward to today then, Vinay. So obviously, capital placements, you guys have grown this company and doing amazing things. For someone listening right now who's potentially, say, a manager of a team in a large organization, or someone who maybe has a startup or a small team, and they're looking for additional help, could you give an example or maybe a case study of a particular client who have used placements, and then kind of like how those placements or how those people have added value to their operations or to their business?
Thanks for that question, Dale. It's quite difficult to give a particular case study or an example, because over the 8 years, we've built up an incredible array of employers that we work with. There's actually over 1,500 companies across the world that we work with, and we do hundreds of internships each year. So it's and these companies range, all the way from startups, which have probably secured some kind of seed funding and have grown to a team of 3, 4, 5, all the way up to like the big four that we work with in certain parts of the world. So it's quite a big range of firms that we work with, and the type of internships. But I think some of the principles still say the same in terms of one of the things that we are adamant about is that these internships have to be mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
So it's not just obviously when someone says interns, I think maybe 10 years ago, the stereotypical interns image that most people come across is either interns photocopying or grabbing coffee.
Yeah, yeah.
That has changed a lot. And obviously,
Which
I
is
think,
good. That's
yeah,
good, right?
exactly.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, there's this expectation of like, oh, they're an intern, like you just dump all the stuff you don't want to do on their lap, and that's it. They don't actually get any, kind of tangible experience. But it's yeah, it's good to see that that's evolved now, and there's a lot more kind of measures in place, because I think that's some people as well are afraid, like, oh, like if I work for free, like it's a lot of investment and time, and if you've got kind of nothing to show for it at the end, that could be like just really disheartening.
Exactly. And I think what businesses, or especially smart businesses, have realized is internships can be mutually beneficial. So it's not just for the intern, but the business can get a lot from these experiences as well. A very good example is things like digital marketing today. Companies that's been around for 10, 15, 20 years, or even a lot of businesses are founded by people that don't really understand digital marketing too well, as an example.
Yeah.
And they might have products or services that are aimed at millennials or Generation Z. And if you need to target those, you need to use perhaps social media channels that you might not even have heard of, as an example. So, so this is where mutual benefits come in, because the intern has to gain from the experience as well as the employer. So we've seen a huge rise in digital marketing over the last probably 18 to 24 months. And that coincides with a lot of new platforms that's coming across, things like TikTok, Snapchat, WeChat as platforms. So these interns come in and they can add a lot of value. But at the same time, they're not the finished product. They're not a full-time employee. They're there to learn, and we try and make sure that it's clear to both parties. But a well-designed internship program will be mutually beneficial, and both parties can gain a lot from that experience. And I think anyone that's considering taking interns should always go in with that mindset. If not, it's not going to be a great relationship. And with platforms like Glassdoor coming up to, where if you search a company's name, it's one of the first links that you might see in Google. And it is going to put off future employees from applying if an intern has a bad experience and they post about that on the company's Glassdoor website, as an example. So it is something that people do need to think quite clearly about. And I think the vast majority of employers that we work with do it from a perspective where they are trying to pass on the knowledge to the next generation and train them up at the same time. And so they come in with good intentions. They know what the expectations are, and they are really, really good quality employers. And that reflects in the future when you're looking to hire. These interns will go on and leave positive reviews about their experience on Glassdoor, which makes hiring down the line a lot easier. And also, these interns, a lot of the employers that have taken on interns love to keep them on. So it might be on a freelance basis at the end of the internship when the student goes back to university. I had a cousin who did an internship with a med tech company. She then, after the summer internship, the company really liked her work. And quite interestingly, she was helping them with podcasts. And she was doing all the editing, and she was doing a lot of the technical stuff, which the company just did not have the skill set for. But what we are seeing is a lot of the young students that now just know how to edit videos, edit podcasts, things like that, which don't come naturally, or may not be something that a lot of the employees might have that skill set in-house. So when she finished the internship, the employer said, "We'd love to use your skills. Could you do 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week with us, and we'll pay you for that?" So, which is great for her, because she just took it as a hobby. And while she was studying, finishing off her degree, she was getting paid through the employer. So it can lead to long-term benefits for both parties.
That's brilliant, and it's kind of bled into my next question, Vinay, which is great. I said I was going to ask, what are the advantages of remote placements over traditional? Obviously, we've just touched upon, people, interns can kind of bring skills to the table that you might not necessarily have within the organization. Obviously, talk about remote placements, the geographical element of it naturally is going to be an advantage, because you can technically hire kind of anyone from all over the world, really. Any other advantages would you say, Vinay, particularly say remote placements over the traditional kind of in-person placements? Obviously, both have kind of great merits, and having someone physically there, there's nothing wrong with that either. A lot of people still want, to have, actual physical interns show up and physically be there. But any other advantages you can put forward of, the remote placement particularly?
Sure. I think it's just as you said, a remote internship is not about replicating a traditional internship. And I think that expectation needs to be set quite early on, because both have incredible advantages and disadvantages as well. But I think anyone that's considering taking on a remote intern or taking on a remote employee, they first need to understand that it is a very different process and it is a very different experience. So I think if an employer comes in with an expectation that it's going to be almost identical, it is setting themselves up for failure. So I think we just need to be realistic, and we need to acknowledge the positives and the negatives, and then obviously any employer or intern that are looking to go down this path can make an informed decision. I think one of the biggest benefits that we've noticed is it makes it so much more accessible. Your talent pool is much bigger. If you think about a employer, usually you post that, if you typically think about an experience that you effectively usually post a job advert, people reply with a CV, with a cover letter, maybe a few questions that you have asked, they'll come back to you. One of the first things you look at is where they're based, or can they work in my office? And that naturally restricts you to your talent pool, or the size of the talent pool that is available to you. With a remote internship, you take that away. You can essentially pick up the best talent from the best part of the world to do that. And we've seen that over the past 10, 15 years, where a lot of the employers are getting really, really good quality talent, but just outside their local area. And I think that's a huge benefit. And I think sometimes we just have our biases where we look for candidates which are close to us, and so it's very easy to hire them, bring them into the office, but we're overlooking a massive talent pool that's available to us by just overlooking remote internships or remote employees. And I think that has to be one of the biggest advantages of having a remote employee, because your talent pool is much bigger. The other thing is, I think, especially we work with some very, very small employers as well. So I think the smallest employer that we work with will probably have 3 or 4 employees, and they work out from co-working spaces where they have a dedicated space or a dedicated room. And one of the things that we've got to acknowledge is, somewhere like, if you're based in somewhere like WeWork, you're paying anywhere between £400 to £600 a desk. And having an employee based out in your office is expensive. And one of the obvious benefits, a lot of employers talk about numbers, and having a remote intern saves a lot of cost. I'm not saying you should take on remote people just purely from a cost saving perspective, but it does make a big difference.
There is an advantage to it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it cannot be overlooked, especially if you're a small team. A lot of the small businesses that we work with, I have really close friends who run very small businesses, and often, paying £600 per desk, and then all the other expenses that come with having someone in an office, it could be a 4-figure sum each month that you're spending on someone who's based out in your office. By not having them in a workplace, in the same workplace as you, could save a lot of money as well. So I think those two are the biggest benefits, but I think being remote as well, it gives a lot of flexibility. And I think a lot of interns, as well as employees that we've seen, is they take on multiple projects at a time. So it's not just, they're not restricted to just one employee. So we do work with interns where they do exclusively work 40, 45 hours per week for one employer. But we also have remote internships where they do 2 times 20 hours or 2 times 15 hours per week with 2 different companies, basically. And so what that means is, from an employer's perspective, it's almost like taking someone part-time, and you can give them work when you have it, and you don't necessarily have the cost of having them when you don't necessarily have enough work for them.
Yeah,
so
you don't have to overcommit to it. Yeah,
exactly. Taking someone on full-time, it does come with a lot of restrictions. You are restricted in certain ways. If you have certainty of revenue, if you landed a big project that requires, you to be occupied for the next 8 to 12 months, it's great. You can take on someone, obviously, and grow that business. But a lot of small businesses are not in that position. And taking on remote interns or remote employees could be a great option where you get that flexibility without that cost. And I think from an employer's perspective, those are the biggest advantages. And from an employee's or an intern's perspective, the biggest advantage is having the ability to work for companies based around the world. And it's great for them from my experiences, primarily working with current students and recent graduates. And for them, they could be based out in any country and they can work for an employer in New York. So they can actually work for an employer based in London and Singapore at the same time. And so for them to add that to their CV is
so
just amazing,
isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. And just dealing with two different cultures, getting that experience, and work is done differently in different parts of the world. Anyone that's traveled to different continents can tell you that the way business is conducted, the way people communicate, the way business is conducted, it's just so different in different parts of the world. And just having an understanding of that is invaluable, so that in the future, if you are working, and I'm just going to go back to using marketing as an example, you've got to understand your customer. So just having understanding of how customers think and how they operate in some of these countries will give you a huge advantage when you're trying to market to them, as an example.
Fantastic. We touched on it a little bit then, Vinay, but let's move now to, we said obviously there's pros and cons to having interns within the organization. From kind of your personal experience and what you've seen, what are some of the kind of consistent challenges that you see with remote placements, and then how do you overcome them, or how do you advise organizations that this is how you deal with this particular challenge, or this is what we advise you do to deal with XYZ?
Sure. This comes down to, I think, firstly acknowledging that there could be issues, rather than waiting for issues to come up and for it to be a bigger problem than it actually needs to be. So as I said, the first part of overcoming a challenge is actually recognizing that it is a challenge. Yeah. And so we just like to highlight a few things to employers when we work with them, to say, okay, you do, both the employer and the employee actually, or intern in this case, these are some of the things that you probably perhaps need to spend a bit more time or invest a bit more time, because things like culture is very, when you're working from your study in your office versus your office space where you are based out in and where you've got colleagues around you, it's very difficult to replicate that culture. When you have a remote team or a remote person, they might not necessarily be part of that culture, and we need to recognize that and get them involved, or at least for them to understand. A lot of these things are things that you pick up rather than things that are explicitly told to you. So you miss out on a lot of those. You miss out on a few office jokes, some of the inside jokes. So you might be part of a WhatsApp group, part of a work WhatsApp group, but then you might not necessarily understand what's going on because the context to it was discussed, and the joke probably was posted on the WhatsApp group, and some of the people may not necessarily understand what that joke is about. And so culture is one of those things. An obvious one is time zone. And I think it depends, if you're based in London and you have a remote employee based out in Australia, there's going to be very little overlap, if any, in terms of the work hours, basically. So that needs to be acknowledged, and people need to find a solution to that. So we have a couple of people that work remotely for us. So we've got a couple who are based only the time zones are only a few hours away. So they pretty much work UK hours, and we've got some which work further away, but for those roles, they're a bit more flexible. So they don't necessarily need to work UK hours. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that and make sure that we find a time that works for everyone. At least once a week, we try and get everyone together on a call, just even if it is just to say hi and just have a bit of FaceTime. That goes a long way. And I think a lot of our employees, especially the remote ones, appreciate that, because that's pretty much the only FaceTime that they get with everyone within the company at the same time. Even though they might have one-on-ones with a few people in our team, but as a company, we try and get everyone together on a call, and that makes a big difference. It helps with the culture as well, so that people understand. And I think we've all been there where messages are probably been misunderstood, and you can't get the tone right in most of the messages. And often just seeing and speaking to that person on a video call will go a long way in terms of understanding what that person's like. If they have a dry sense of humor, are they sarcastic? Because it's not very easy to pick up sarcasm in a text message, as an
Yeah,
example. So
exactly.
all of those things, these are things that needs to be acknowledged, and you probably, as an employer and an employee, need to have a good understanding of the challenges of remote internship, and perhaps put that extra effort in to make sure those challenges can be overcome. A lot of the other, so a couple of other points that I want to touch up on in terms of challenges is, especially from from someone junior looking up, working with a be a manager or a founder, they do look up to these people, and they a lot of things that they try and pick up on are, it's not just what you say, it's also how you say it, your body language, etc., which they potentially miss out on a remote internship, and it's something that we try and acknowledge. Being in the same room as someone, as a founder, there's a lot of things that you can pick up, not just from the way they conduct themselves, the way they walk, the way they prepare for a meeting, which you might not necessarily see if you're working remotely. So we try and ask the employers to be a bit more open about those kind of things, like, okay, so this is how we prepare for meetings, etc. And just putting in that time and effort with those interns to make sure that the interns don't, there are going to be aspects that they are going to miss out on, and that's obvious. And I think there's no point trying to hide that from both parties. But at the same time, if we acknowledge it, we can try and reduce the gap as much as possible. And the final point I just want to bring up is, it's actually proven that we trust people that we see a lot more than people that we don't necessarily see. And I think when you're working with colleagues, there's some things which are incredibly confidential, and you want to make sure that you can trust them with it. And so trust, it's not as easy to build up trust when you're working remotely. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged as well. But that can be overcome. I think if you look at a historical example of, a few decades ago, the concept of pen pals, people used to share very, very confidential stuff or very personal things, but it can be overcome. But it just comes down to just acknowledging that, and just making sure that people realize some of these things are unconscious bias. And so we just need to, subconscious bias rather. So we just need to make sure that those are acknowledged, and that we can take steps to mitigate those as much as possible.
Yeah, that's the great points, Vinay. And I guess just one kind of quick thing I want to add in as well, sort of things I've seen from other places I've worked. When you bring on an intern, I think having a plan in place and kind of knowing very specifically what you need them to do stops this culture, or stops you accidentally falling into this trap of, okay, we have so much work to do, okay, I'm just gonna get the intern to do this, I'm gonna get the intern to do this, just maybe you're overwhelmed or you're overworked. And I think going in, if you are going to hire someone of an intern, or say a junior level, just kind of having a very good idea of their expectations, what you need them to do, and kind of planning that out as well, because I think we've all done it, like someone makes a new hire or someone new joins the team, and then it's like, oh wow, actually we don't have a lot of processes in place for this person, oh wow, we haven't actually mapped out several weeks worth of work for them. So I think, to founders and people thinking about hiring an intern, think about that as well, actually have a plan in place and a series of tasks or deliverables that you need from this person, so that you don't end up just going, oh, well, I'm overworked, or there's lots going on, I'm just going to throw XYZ at them and see how they do.
Absolutely, Dale. I can't agree more. I think that onboarding process and that first few weeks is so important. And if you're dealing with fairly experienced remote workers, I think the first few weeks are really important. And then once the employee gets that culture, they understand what's expected from them, the standard of work, the quality of work that's expected, things can improve. But with an intern, one of the things that we do is, for every internship, that any intern that comes through us, any internship program that gets delivered, both the intern and the employer gets what's called a training plan, which outlines all the different tasks that the intern will be doing, how they will do it, or how they will do it, what the skill sets they will pick up, etc. So both parties can see, even before an internship has started, what's expected from both parties. And so that has gone a long way in terms of setting expectations from both parties. I think traditionally with a lot of internships, employers have not been too sure of what the intern is capable of. And so by creating this training plan, we showcase to the employer, okay, this is where they're at and this is where they want to be at the end of the internship. So as a baseline, this is the level of task that you can give to them, and then you can build on from here. So that's been hugely beneficial. And I think the onboarding is super important. I think I was actually speaking to my colleague yesterday about offboarding process as well. Not a lot of companies spend a lot of time in terms of wrapping things up, because obviously if it's at the end of a project, or if it's the end of an internship, or if it's the end of a contract, fixed period contract, that process of offboarding that person is really important as well, because you want to make sure that you work so hard to make sure that you've had a really good relationship, but you want to maintain that once they finish working with you as well. And so that's something that we've been looking at over the past couple of weeks to see how we can improve that process as well. And I think most businesses can look into that. I think a lot of businesses overlook the offboarding process as well.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that they could potentially look into improving, that would be one. That a lot of businesses have come to me and said, okay, how do we still maintain a really good relationship with this person when they finish with us?
Let's bring it forward then to the current climate. So obviously right now, with everything going on in the world, with COVID and the lockdown, you think about, businesses. Obviously, it's a difficult time right now. A lot of the, people have to manage their budgets a lot more tightly. A lot of businesses are struggling. Contracts are on hold. Maybe they've lost a lot of work. So for a lot of people, the current period right now, remote internships actually could be a very great option for them, to kind of help them through a difficult period where, maybe hires need to be made, but the money isn't there, or, maybe there's a depleted workforce. Maybe some firms or businesses want to move more into a direction of, doing more online webinars, or trying to explore different markets, while this lockdown is happening. I've spoke to quite a few startups and business founders who talk about the amount of time they have right now. It's just like, I've just never had this amount of time to sit down and actually think about my business long term, because the day-to-day of life has kind of calmed down a little bit. So for the current climate, Vinay, have you seen what trends have you seen? Have you seen an increased demand for remote internships? Do you have any interesting kind of stories or case studies of people that have taken on remote internships specifically during this period?
Yeah, firstly, I just want to acknowledge that it is difficult. The vast majority of businesses are struggling. We work with over 400 companies in London, and the vast majority of those, between me and my co-founder, we know most of the founders or senior members of the team, and it is a difficult time. But I'm pretty sure we'll all get through this. There's a lot of government help that's available, and I highly encourage everyone to try and make as much use of it as possible. And to address your question about during this time, we were just talking about this before the start of this call, before the start of this podcast, rather, how we have a lot more time as well now. I think one of the first things I want to acknowledge is that we don't really see interns as a replacement for a full-time employee. And so it's not something that we encourage employers to do, in the sense that we don't expect you to, replace an employee's worth of work with an intern. An intern is a great addition to a team. And one of the things that we do is there's a ratio that we maintain between kind of full-time employees to an intern. So usually that's 4-to-1. So 4 full-time employees to 1 intern. That's to ensure that, the intern is there to just help them rather than essentially replace a member of the team. As to what a lot of businesses are doing, you're right. A lot of businesses have furloughed their staff. It is difficult. A lot of them are pretty much hibernating, but some of the businesses are thinking ahead, or tidying up their house essentially. So what a lot of businesses I've spoken to over the past few weeks have been doing is, as a founder, there are things that you could do. You're juggling a million things. You've dropped a few things along the past few months that you wish you could do, but you just never really got around to doing it. This is the time to do it. And interns could be a great way to kind of help you with those kind of things. They love, we have interns that come in and they're happy to help out where they can. And so if there've been things that you always wanted to do, and the huge area is blogs and content, or just getting
Yeah.
content out there, it takes time. And I'm sure you can agree, Dale, there's a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of writing, a lot of editing. And even once it's all put together, that's not the end of it. You still got to publish it, get it in front of the right people at the right time. And so what we have been seeing is over the past couple of weeks, a lot of employers focusing on content that they can build up and almost build up a content bank that they can kind of use going forward as well. That's one of the areas. What we're also seeing is just generally trying to be helpful where we can. And one of the ways that a lot of people are doing is just mentoring. And if you have the time, if you're a founder of a business, if you work in a business, if you have the time, there are a lot of platforms out there where you've got young students and adults that are pretty worried, and they this is obviously something very new to them, and it's new to all of us. But if you have the time where you can mentor someone, set aside an hour a week, an hour a month, where you can speak to them about what you do, how you got to where you are, etc., that will give a lot of motivation for a lot of young students. And that's something that we've seen a lot of people do, so that essentially offer mentorship. So they're not just staying at home. Even the ones that have been furloughed, they've been, a lot of the staff that we work with in companies have come and said, okay, is there any way that we can contribute? We're looking to volunteer. Are there any young students that we can speak to that could potentially help, that could potentially use our experience? And so that's something that we've been trying to do, but we've been trying to connect senior business leaders and founders of businesses to young students who are at home. And what they can do is advise them on the skills gap that they have. There is a big gap between academia and the workplace. And if they can't intern and get work experience, there are other things that they can do. And these business leaders are essentially just guiding them on what they can do to kind of upskill themselves during this time, because a lot of universities have switched their classes online, but workload has reduced a lot. So a lot of universities have scrapped exams and stuff. So you've got a lot of very young adults that are just sitting idle at home, and we just want to make sure that they can make the most out of this time. And so that's something that we would highly recommend if anyone can do. Contact your local university, ask them if there's any way that you can contribute in terms of their helping their careers department. That's something that we would highly encourage doing.
So speaking of the future, Vinay, if we have a startup owner right now, or a manager or a business owner who is listening and thinking, you know what, yeah, maybe, like I said, maybe not quite now because of the current climate, maybe they would like someone now, but, even if thinking about in the future, if they do think hiring an intern is a good option for them, something they're intrigued by, could you just very quickly talk us through kind of how does the process work? What would they do from this point onwards, and how do you essentially ensure that they're getting, the right person, or, someone that they know they'll get a lot of value from?
Sure, Dale. I think one of the things that a lot of employers have come back to me at the end of taking an intern and have said to me is it's been an incredibly rewarding experience for them as well. And I think a lot of people like mentoring and passing on their knowledge, and they've been able to do that. And you've got someone who's quite eager to learn those things and pick up those things from you. And so a lot of the employers have found that incredibly rewarding as well. And if anyone's interested in taking on interns, highly recommend doing it. If you go onto our website, there's a ton of resources. Just search capital placement on Google with the first link. There's an employer section. One of the things that we do provide a lot of support and a lot of resources to employers, whether you've taken on 0 interns or 500 interns in the past few years. We've got resources that will help you throughout that process, and you will work with one single person with capital placement who will be your single account manager. And we don't charge anything either to an employer. So it's completely free. We will help you, and we'll make sure that you can design a very good internship program for your interns. And just all the information's on our website.
Fantastic. Well, Vinay, thank you so much for giving me a bit of your time today. That was incredibly insightful and kind of very relevant right now, as I think we're all seeing that, when businesses do, I'll put this in quotes, return to normal, because I do think that there will be some kind of pretty big societal changes after this. But, when things do return to normal, in the loosest sense of the word, kind of knowing that that remote can be done, right? A lot of businesses are going to go back now and think, well, actually, this worked very well for us. our team were productive. We had a very good system in place, and that can extend to internships. Like you said, it doesn't have to be a physical thing where the person shows up every day. There's so much talent and untapped potential out there. So it's great to see you guys kind of harnessing in that potential and giving these opportunities to companies all over the world. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you, Dale, for having me. And like you said, it is a difficult time, but I think what we have seen over the past few weeks is that remote working is very much possible. A lot of people were sitting on the fence or were skeptical of the idea, but now that we've been forced into doing it, I think people have realized that it might have taken some businesses a few days to get used to it, but once you do have that, have a proper setup in place, that's probably a whole different podcast in terms of how to set up a proper remote workplace, but I'll leave that to you, Dale. But once that is done, I think it can be incredibly productive.